The man behind the empire. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, and by the time midnight arrived, it was the kind of rain that didn't just wet the ground. It soaked through walls, through windows, through the carefully constructed barriers that people spend years building around their hearts. It was the kind of rain that made even the strongest people stop pretending, even if just for one night. And on this particular night, in a massive house that sat on the edge of a private hill overlooking the city, a man who had never allowed himself to stop pretending was finally running out of strength to keep going. His name was Don Rafael Serrano, though almost no one alive dared to say his full name out loud without lowering their voice first. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that had seen things most people would never believe, and hands that had made decisions that shaped the underground world of 3 cities. He had built his empire from nothing, from a hungry, fatherless boy who grew up on broken streets to a man who now controlled contracts, territories, and the fear of dozens of dangerous men. On paper and in the shadows, he was untouchable. He was powerful. He was everything that men in his world were supposed to want to be. But power, as it turns out, is one of the loneliest things a person can carry. That night, Don Rafael sat in his private study on the 2nd floor, surrounded by leather furniture, dark wood shelves filled with books he never read, and a glass of expensive whiskey that he had already refilled 4 times. The lights in the room were dim. There was no music playing. There were no bodyguards standing nearby because he had dismissed everyone hours ago with a single wave of his hand. He didn't want guards. He didn't want staff. He didn't want people watching him the way they always watched him, with fear hidden behind obedience, with respect that was really just carefully disguised terror. He was alone, and tonight, that aloneness felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. He stared at the rain through the tall window beside his desk, watching it run in long, twisted lines down the glass, and he thought about his life in a way he usually refused to let himself think. He thought about the meeting he had attended that afternoon, where 2 of his closest associates had argued over money, until one of them slammed his hand on the table so hard that a glass shattered. He thought about the phone call he had received that morning from a man who owed him a debt and had begged, voice-breaking, for just 1 more week. He thought about the look on that man's face. He hadn't seen the face. It was just a phone call, but he had imagined it, and he hadn't been able to stop imagining it since. He thought about a rival who had sent him a message 3 days ago, a message designed to be threatening, and how he had responded with cold efficiency, the way he always did, without blinking, without hesitating, without feeling anything visible. And then he thought about his mother, who had died 6 years ago in a small apartment across town, in a neighborhood he had long since left behind. She had not died in comfort. She had died in a clean but modest room, surrounded by 2 nurses and a priest, and Don Rafael had been sitting in a car outside the building because he had been told not to go in, because someone had followed him there, and going inside would have put everyone in danger. He had sat in that car for 3 hours while his mother took her last breath somewhere above him, and he had not cried. He had pressed his jaw together and he had stared at the steering wheel, and he had told himself that this was the cost of the life he had chosen, and that cost was something a man had to accept without breaking. He had never cried for her, not once. Until now. The whiskey had done something to the lock he kept on his chest. It had loosened the bolts just enough, just barely enough, and for the first time in 6 years, Don Rafael Serrano felt the tears come. They didn't fall dramatically. They didn't pour down his face the way they did in movies. They came slowly, quietly, almost uncertainly, as if even his own body wasn't sure it was allowed to grieve. One tear, then another, running down the side of his face while he sat perfectly still in the leather chair, the whiskey glass still in his hand, the rain still falling against the window. And in that moment, a knock came at the study door, soft, careful, the kind of knock that asked permission before assuming anything. "Sir," said a voice from behind the door, gentle but clear. "I saw the light under the door. I just wanted to make sure everything was all right." It was her. Her name was Clara Mendez, and she had worked in this house for almost 3 years. She was 34 years old, quiet in the way that still water is quiet, not empty, not absent, but deeply calm, the kind of calm that comes from a person who has learned to be steady in difficult circumstances. She was not beautiful in the loud, obvious way that the world usually celebrates. She was beautiful in the way that a warm light in a cold room is beautiful. You didn't always notice it right away, but once you did, you couldn't imagine the space without it. She had come to work in Don Raphael's household through a placement agency, recommended by a woman who had previously cleaned for one of his business associates. She had arrived with a single bag, 2 references, and an expression that was polite without being eager. She had not seemed afraid of him on the first day, which had surprised him. Almost everyone was afraid of him on the first day, on every day, and that fear usually never went away. But Clara had looked at him, nodded respectfully, asked what time he preferred his breakfast, and gone about her work with a quiet efficiency that had somehow, over the months, become one of the few constants in his life that he actually looked forward to. She had never once asked him about his business. She had never whispered with the other staff. She had never flinched when men with visible weapons walked through the hallways, though he had noticed that she always moved to give them space, carefully, without drawing attention to herself. She had cleaned up after dinners where the conversation had been tense enough to make the air feel thick, and she had done so without comment, without expression, without curiosity. But she also did something that no one else in his world did. She noticed him. Not the boss, not the don, not the dangerous man at the head of the table. She noticed him, the actual person underneath all of that. When he hadn't eaten properly for 2 days, she had left a covered plate outside his study without being asked, without a note, just the food and a small glass of water beside it. When he had come home late one night with a cut on his forearm that he hadn't explained, she had appeared in the hallway with a first aid kit held out toward him, her expression asking nothing, simply offering. When he had dismissed the entire household for a week over a security concern and told everyone to leave the premises, she had been the last to go, and she had paused at the front door and turned back to look at him, just looked, for a moment, and then she had said quietly, "Take care of yourself, sir," and walked out into the morning. He had stood at the window and watched her leave that day, and something in him had moved that he hadn't been able to name or explain. He had tried not to think about her in ways that crossed the careful lines he drew for himself. She worked for him. She was good and kind and honest in ways that he was not, had not been for a very long time, perhaps had never been. The world he lived in would not be safe for someone like her, and he knew that clearly enough to have buried whatever feeling had started growing inside him long before it could become something he acted on, or so he had believed. But 4 drinks into the worst night he had allowed himself in years, when she knocked gently on his study door and asked if he was all right, Don Rafael Serrano found that he could not say anything. He could not say the usual words. He could not say, "I'm fine, go back to bed," the way he had said them a dozen times before. The lock was too loose tonight. The rain was too heavy. The grief for his mother and the weight of every year of his life were sitting on him all at once, and the sound of her voice, steady, careful, genuinely concerned, broke through the last wall he had. He stood up from the chair unsteadily and walked to the door, and he opened it. She stood in the hallway in her plain house clothes, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes wide with something that was not fear but was close to worry. She looked at him, at the glass in his hand, at the expression on his face that he could not control, at the tears he hadn't wiped away, and she didn't move. She didn't retreat. She didn't look away. He opened his mouth, and what came out was not an order, not a dismissal, not the cold, controlled voice of a man who ran an empire. What came out was a broken whisper, barely louder than the rain behind him. "I can't do this anymore," he said. And the look that crossed her face in that moment, not pity, not fear, not judgment, but something far more devastating in its gentleness, made him feel more exposed than he had felt in his entire life. The rain kept falling. Neither of them moved. And something between them, something that had been building quietly for 3 years, finally stood in the open air between them, real, fragile, and impossible to pretend away. The night that changed everything. The hallway was dark except for the soft glow of a single lamp that sat on a small table near the staircase, casting long shadows against the walls and making the space feel smaller than it actually was. The rain continued to beat against the windows at the end of the corridor, a steady rhythm that filled the silence between them. And for what felt like an entire minute, neither Don Raphael nor Clara moved or spoke. They simply stood there, separated by the open doorway, looking at each other in a way that neither of them had ever allowed themselves to look before. Clara had seen him in many states over the 3 years she had worked in this house. She had seen him calm and controlled during important dinners where powerful men sat around his table and spoke in low voices about things she deliberately chose not to understand. She had seen him cold and distant on mornings after difficult nights, when his jaw was tight, and his eyes carried a hardness that made the other staff members avoid him entirely. She had seen him tired, she had seen him frustrated, and she had once seen him angry in a way that had made her step back into the kitchen and wait until the storm passed before continuing her work. But she had never seen him like this. She had never seen him broken. His eyes were red, not just from the whiskey but from something deeper, something that looked like years of pain finally forcing its way to the surface. His shoulders, usually so straight and commanding, seemed to curve inward slightly, as if the weight he carried had finally become too heavy to hold upright. His hand still held the glass of whiskey, but loosely now, almost forgotten, and the way he looked at her was not the way a powerful man looks at someone who works for him. It was the way a drowning person looks at the only solid ground they can see. "Sir," Clara said softly, and the word felt wrong as soon as it left her mouth, too formal for this moment, too distant for the rawness she could see in his face. She tried again, her voice steady but gentle. "What happened? Are you hurt?" He laughed at that, but it was not a real laugh. It was the kind of sound a person makes when they have no other way to respond to a question that misses the point entirely. He shook his head slowly, and the movement seemed to take effort, as if even that simple gesture required more energy than he had left. "Hurt," he repeated, and his voice was rough, uneven in a way she had never heard before. "No, Clara, I am not hurt, not in the way you mean." He paused, and his eyes dropped to the floor for a moment before rising again to meet hers. "I am tired. I am so tired that I do not remember what it feels like to not be tired. And tonight, for some reason I cannot explain, I cannot pretend that I am not." Clara felt something shift in her chest, a small but unmistakable movement, like a door opening just slightly. She had spent 3 years being careful in this house. She had spent 3 years keeping her head down, doing her work well, and never allowing herself to see the man she worked for as anything other than her employer. It was safer that way. It was smarter that way. She knew what kind of world he lived in, and she knew that getting too close to that world was dangerous in ways that went far beyond losing a job. But standing here now, looking at the pain in his eyes, she found that all of her careful distance felt suddenly inadequate, even cruel. "Would you like to sit down?" she asked, and the question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. "There is a chair in my room, or we could go back to the study. You should not be standing in the hallway like this." He stared at her for a long moment, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or confusion, or maybe something closer to wonder. People did not offer Don Rafael Serrano chairs. People did not look at him with concern instead of fear. People did not speak to him in soft voices and ask what he needed. And yet here she was, this quiet woman who had worked in his house for 3 years, looking at him as if he were simply a person having a difficult night, as if his title and his power and his reputation meant nothing in this moment. "Your room," he said, and the words came out before he could think about whether they were appropriate. "I do not want to go back to the study. I have spent too many hours in that room already tonight, and every corner of it reminds me of things I do not want to think about." Clara hesitated for just a moment, and he saw it, that small flash of uncertainty, the quick calculation that any sensible person would make when a powerful and slightly intoxicated man asked to enter her private space. He understood that hesitation, and in some distant part of his mind that was still functioning clearly, he respected it. She had every reason to be cautious. She had every reason to say no, to politely suggest that he return to his own quarters, to maintain the boundaries that had kept both of them safe for 3 years. But she did not say no. Instead, she stepped back and opened the door wider, and she said, "Come in then, but you should give me that glass. I think you have had enough tonight." The room was small compared to the other rooms in the house, but it was clean and warm and filled with small touches that he had never seen before. There was a narrow bed against one wall, covered with a simple quilt that looked handmade, the kind of thing a grandmother might create over months of patient work. There was a wooden chair near the window, and a small table beside it that held a book, a reading lamp, and a cup that still had traces of tea at the bottom. There were no decorations on the walls except for a single photograph in a simple frame, a picture of a woman who looked like an older version of Clara, standing in front of a modest house with flowers growing along the front path. Raphael walked into the room slowly, taking in these details with the kind of attention he usually reserved for studying contracts or assessing threats. But there was no threat here. There was only the quiet evidence of a life being lived simply and honestly, and something about that evidence made his chest ache in a way he had not expected. Clara took the glass from his hand, and when their fingers touched briefly during the exchange, neither of them acknowledged it, though both of them felt it. She set the glass on her small table and then gestured toward the wooden chair. "Sit," she said. "I will get you some water. You need to drink something that is not whiskey." He sat, and for a moment he simply looked at her as she moved around the small room, finding a clean cup and filling it from a pitcher she kept on a low shelf. Her movements were efficient but unhurried, the same calm competence she brought to everything she did, and watching her felt like watching something from another world, a world where things were simple and honest and did not require constant vigilance. "Why do you stay here?" he asked suddenly, and the question hung in the air between them. Clara turned to look at him, the cup of water in her hand. "What do you mean?" "This house," he said. "This job, you must know what kind of man I am. You must know what happens in the rooms you clean, what decisions are made in the meetings you serve food to. Any sensible person would have left a long time ago. Any sensible person would be afraid." He paused, and his voice dropped lower. "Why are you not afraid of me?" She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her thinking, choosing her words with the same care she brought to everything. Then she walked over and handed him the cup of water, and she sat down on the edge of her bed, facing him, her hands folded in her lap. "I was afraid," she said. "In the beginning, I was very afraid. I knew what I was walking into when I took this job. I knew there would be things I would see and hear that I would have to pretend not to notice. And I told myself that I would stay for 6 months, save as much money as I could, and then find something else." She paused. "But then something changed." "What changed?" he asked, and he found that he was leaning forward slightly, his entire attention focused on her answer in a way that surprised him. "You did," she said simply. "Or maybe you did not change. Maybe I just started to see you more clearly." She looked at him, and her eyes were steady and unafraid. "I saw the way you spoke to old Miguel when his wife was sick and he needed time off. You told him to take as long as he needed, and you paid for her hospital bills without ever mentioning it to anyone. You thought no one knew, but I knew. I handled the household accounts, and I saw the payments." She paused. "I saw the way you treated the young boy who delivers groceries, the one with the limp. You always make sure he gets extra money, and you always ask about his mother. You think no one notices these things, but I notice." Raphael felt something crack inside him, something that had been holding firm for so long that he had forgotten it could break. He looked down at the cup of water in his hands, and he found that he could not speak. "You are not a good man," Clara continued, and her voice was not harsh but honest. "I know that. I am not foolish enough to pretend that the things you do are not real, or that the people who fear you do not have reason to fear you. But you are also not only the things you do in that world. You are also the man who sits alone in his study for hours, staring at the rain. You are the man who has not had a single visitor who came just to see him, not for business, not for favors, in the entire time I have worked here. You are the man who leaves his plate untouched on nights when the weight seems too heavy, and who does not know that someone sees him and worries about him and wishes she could help." The silence that followed her words was so complete that the rain against the window sounded like thunder. Raphael looked up at her, and for the first time in more years than he could remember, he did not try to hide what he was feeling. He let her see it all, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the desperate hunger for something real in a life that had become nothing but performance and power. "Clara," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded different than it ever had before. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond, because if I do not say this now, I do not think I will ever have the courage to say it again." She nodded slowly, and her hands tightened slightly in her lap, but she did not look away. "For 3 years," he began, and his voice was rough with emotion, "I have watched you move through this house. I have watched you bring order to chaos, bring kindness to a place that has very little of it, bring light to rooms that I had forgotten could be anything other than dark. And for 3 years, I have told myself that what I feel when I see you is nothing. I have told myself that you are my employee, that you deserve better than to be noticed by a man like me, that the only thing I could ever bring to your life is danger and complication and pain." He paused, and he took a breath that shook slightly on the way in. "But tonight," he continued, "I cannot tell myself those things anymore. Tonight the walls I have built are not strong enough to hold, and I am sitting here in your room looking at you, and I cannot pretend that I do not feel what I feel." His eyes met hers, and they were bright with unshed tears. "I love you, Clara. I have loved you for longer than I want to admit, and I have been terrified to say it because I know that I have no right to love someone like you. I know that you should run from me, that any sensible woman would run from me, and I would not blame you if you did." The words hung in the air between them, raw and exposed and impossible to take back. Clara sat very still on the edge of her bed, and Raphael could not read her expression. He waited, his heart beating so hard he could feel it in his throat, and he prepared himself for the rejection he was certain was coming. She would be kind about it, he knew. She was too good a person to be cruel. But she would tell him no, and she would be right to tell him no. And tomorrow she would probably leave this house and never come back, and he would have lost the one person who had ever made him feel like something other than a monster. But then Clara did something he had not expected. She stood up from the bed, and she walked over to where he sat, and she knelt down in front of him so that their eyes were level. She reached out and took the cup of water from his hands, setting it aside, and then she took his hands in hers, his hands which had done terrible things, which had signed orders and made decisions that kept him awake at night, and she held them gently, as if they were precious. "Do you know what I have learned in my life?" she said softly. "I have learned that love is not something we earn. It is not something we deserve or do not deserve. It is something that happens to us, whether we are ready for it or not, whether we think we are worthy of it or not." She squeezed his hands. "I have watched you too, Raphael. I have watched you for 3 years, and I have seen the man you hide from everyone else. And I have loved that man for longer than I want to admit, even though I told myself it was foolish, even though I told myself it could never lead anywhere, even though I knew that the world you live in and the world I come from are so different that they should never touch." His breath caught in his chest, and he could not move, could not speak, could barely believe what he was hearing. "But they have touched," she said. "They are touching right now, and I do not want to pretend any more either." The rain continued to fall outside, but inside that small room, something new was beginning, something fragile and unexpected, and more terrifying than anything either of them had ever faced. Raphael looked at the woman kneeling before him, this woman who had somehow seen through every wall he had built, and he felt the tears finally fall freely down his face. "I do not know how to do this," he whispered. "I do not know how to love someone without destroying them. I do not know how to protect you from the world I live in. I do not know how to be the man you deserve." Clara reached up and touched his face, wiping away his tears with gentle fingers. "Then we will learn together," she said. "One day at a time, one moment at a time, and we will start right now tonight with this." She leaned forward and she kissed him, softly, carefully, a question more than a statement. And when he kissed her back, something inside him that had been frozen for decades finally began to thaw. But outside the walls of that quiet room, the world Raphael had built was watching. And in the shadows of the empire he controlled, there were men who had noticed his weakness, men who were already beginning to plan, men who would stop at nothing to take what he had. The peace of this night would not last. The storm was only beginning. The price of love. The morning after that rainy night arrived with an almost impossible gentleness, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Sunlight crept through the curtains of Clara's small room, painting soft golden lines across the floor and across the two people who had fallen asleep sitting together in the wooden chair by the window, her head resting against his shoulder and his arm wrapped around her as if he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. They had talked for hours after that first kiss, sharing pieces of themselves that they had never shared with anyone else, and somewhere in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion had finally claimed them both. Raphael woke first, and for a long moment he did not move. He simply sat there, feeling the warmth of her body against his, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, and trying to remember the last time he had felt anything close to peace. It had been so long that the feeling was almost foreign to him, like a language he had once spoken fluently but had forgotten over years of disuse. But here it was, real and present and undeniable, and he found himself making a silent promise to whatever force in the universe had brought him to this moment. A promise that he would do whatever it took to protect this feeling, to protect her, to become worthy of the trust she had placed in him. But even as he made that promise, some part of him knew that the world he had built would not simply step aside and allow him to be happy. The empire he controlled was not a thing that could be set down like a heavy bag and walked away from. It was a living, breathing entity with its own needs and demands, and it was populated by men who watched for weakness the way wolves watch for limping prey. If they sensed that Don Rafael Serrano had developed a vulnerability, they would exploit it without hesitation. And Clara, this gentle woman who had somehow found a way to love him despite everything she knew about who he was, would become a target. He knew this with absolute certainty, and the knowledge sat heavy in his chest even as he breathed in the scent of her hair, and allowed himself one more moment of pretending that the outside world did not exist. Clara stirred against him, and when she opened her eyes and looked up at his face, she smiled, a small, sleepy smile that made something in his chest tighten with an emotion he could not name. "You are still here," she said softly, as if she had half expected him to disappear in the night, to return to being the distant and untouchable man she had worked for rather than the vulnerable person who had knocked on her door. "I am still here," he confirmed, and his voice was rough with sleep but also with something deeper. "And I am not going anywhere, but Clara, we need to talk about what happens now. We need to talk about how to keep you safe." The smile faded from her face, replaced by an expression of serious understanding. She had known this conversation was coming. She had known from the moment she decided to open her heart to him that their love would come with complications that ordinary love did not carry. But she had made her choice with her eyes open, and she was not the kind of woman who retreated from difficult things simply because they were difficult. "I know," she said. "I have been thinking about it too. I know that there are people who would use me to hurt you if they knew what I mean to you. I know that your world is dangerous in ways that I do not fully understand." She sat up straighter, and her eyes met his with a steadiness that reminded him why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. "But I also know that I do not want to hide. I do not want to pretend that this is not real or that we are not what we are to each other. I spent too many years being invisible, Raphael. I do not want to be invisible anymore." Her words moved him in ways he had not expected, and he reached out to take her hand, holding it tightly as if he could transfer some of his strength to her through the contact. "You will never be invisible again," he said. "Not to me, not to anyone, but I need time to prepare. I need to put certain protections in place to make sure that the people who might want to harm you cannot reach you. Can you give me that time?" She nodded and her fingers intertwined with his. "How long?" "A few weeks," he said. "Maybe a month. I need to restructure some things, move some pieces on the board, make sure that my position is secure enough that no one would dare to challenge me. And then—" He paused, and when he continued, his voice was filled with a determination that she had never heard before. "And then I am going to step back from the day-to-day operations. I am going to hand over control to people I trust, people who can run things without me being involved in every decision. I want to build a different life, Clara. A life with you. And I cannot do that if I am constantly surrounded by the violence and the danger that has defined my existence for so long." Clara's eyes widened slightly, and he could see the questions forming in her mind. "Is that even possible?" she asked. "Can someone like you simply walk away from everything you have built?" "I do not know," he admitted honestly. "No one in my position has ever tried, at least not that I know of, but I am going to find out, because the alternative is to keep living the way I have been living, and I cannot do that anymore. You asked me last night why I said those words when you opened the door. You asked me what I meant when I said I could not do this anymore. The truth is that I was not just talking about hiding my feelings for you. I was talking about everything, the loneliness, the violence, the constant pretending that none of it affects me. I am 42 years old, and I have spent more than half my life building something that has brought me power and wealth but no peace and no happiness. I do not want to spend the next half the same way." They sat together in the growing morning light, and they talked about the future, not in vague or romantic terms, but in practical ones. They talked about where they might live once it was safe to be together openly, about the kind of life they wanted to build, about the challenges they would face, and how they might overcome them. And with each word they spoke, the bond between them grew stronger and deeper, woven not just from love but from shared purpose and mutual understanding. The weeks that followed were among the most difficult of Raphael's life, but also among the most purposeful. He moved through his days with a focus and clarity that surprised even him, making decisions that he had been putting off for years, confronting problems that he had been avoiding, and slowly, carefully, beginning the process of extricating himself from the most dangerous aspects of his empire. He promoted trusted lieutenants to positions of greater authority, delegating responsibilities that he had always insisted on handling himself. He settled old disputes and closed old accounts, tying up loose ends that had been hanging for too long. And through it all, he carried the thought of Clara with him like a light in the darkness, a reminder of why he was doing this and what he was working toward. But the world he had built was not willing to let him go without a fight. The first sign of trouble came exactly 3 weeks after that rainy night, in the form of a meeting with a man named Victor Delgado. Victor was one of the most powerful figures in the criminal underworld, a man whose territory bordered Raphael's and whose ambitions had always been barely contained by the balance of power between them. They had maintained a careful truce for years, respecting each other's boundaries and avoiding direct conflict. But Raphael had always known that Victor was waiting for an opportunity to expand his influence at Raphael's expense. The meeting took place in a neutral location, a private room in an expensive restaurant that catered to men who preferred discretion. Raphael arrived with two of his most trusted guards, and Victor was already waiting when he walked in, seated at a table with a glass of wine in front of him and a smile on his face that did not reach his eyes. "Raphael," Victor said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Thank you for coming. I know you are a busy man these days. There are rumors that you are making changes to your organization, restructuring, they say, delegating authority to your subordinates." He paused, and his smile widened slightly. "Some people might interpret that as a sign of weakness. Some people might think that the great Don Raphael Serrano is losing his grip on his empire." Raphael sat down across from him, his face betraying nothing of what he was feeling inside. "People can think whatever they want," he said calmly. "My organization is stronger than it has ever been. I am simply choosing to focus my energy on different priorities." "Different priorities," Victor repeated, and there was something in his tone that made Raphael's instincts sharpen. "Yes, I have heard about those as well. There are whispers, Raphael, whispers about a woman, a maid in your household who has apparently caught the attention of the most powerful man in 3 cities. He leaned forward slightly, and his eyes were cold despite the smile still playing on his lips. "Tell me, is it true? Has Don Raphael Serrano, the man who has never shown weakness in his entire career, finally found something that matters to him more than power?" Raphael's blood ran cold, but he did not allow his expression to change. "I do not know what whispers you have been listening to," he said, "but you should be careful about believing everything you hear. Rumors are often started by people who want to cause trouble, and believing them can lead to very unfortunate misunderstandings." Victor laughed, and the sound was not pleasant. "Oh, I am not making any accusations, old friend. I am simply curious. You see, I have been watching you very carefully these past few weeks, and I have noticed certain patterns. You are less visible than you used to be. You are spending more time at your private residence and less time in the places where business is conducted. And there is a certain softness in your demeanor that was not there before. It is subtle, but it is there." He shrugged casually. "I just thought you should know that other people are noticing these things too. People who might not be as understanding as I am." The threat was clear, even though it had been delivered with a smile and wrapped in the language of friendly concern. Raphael understood exactly what Victor was telling him, that his vulnerability had been noticed, that Clara was known about, and that this information could be used against him if he was not careful. He stood up from the table, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an edge of steel that made Victor's smile falter slightly. "Let me be very clear about something," Raphael said. "I do not respond well to threats, whether they are direct or implied, and anyone who thinks that they can use anything or anyone against me will discover very quickly that they have made a serious miscalculation." He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "I have spent 20 years building my reputation, and in that time, many people have made the mistake of thinking they saw weakness where there was none. Those people are no longer around to repeat their mistake. I suggest you learn from their example." He turned and walked out of the restaurant without looking back, but his mind was racing. Victor knew about Clara. That meant others knew too, or would know soon. The protection he had been putting in place was not complete yet, and the timeline he had been working with was no longer realistic. He needed to act faster, or the woman he loved would be in danger. That night, Raphael returned home with a heaviness in his heart that even the sight of Clara waiting for him could not entirely lift. He told her everything, about the meeting with Victor, about the threat that had been implied, about the reality of what they were facing. And as he spoke, he watched her face carefully, expecting to see fear, expecting to see regret for the choice she had made, expecting to see the beginning of a retreat from everything they had built together. But Clara did not retreat. Instead, she listened quietly until he was finished, and then she reached out and took his hands in hers, the same way she had on that first night when he had confessed his love. "I knew this would not be easy," she said. I knew from the beginning that loving you would mean facing things that other people never have to face, but I made my choice with my eyes open, Raphael. I chose you, and I choose you again now, even knowing what we are up against." Her eyes were steady and unafraid. "We will face this together. Whatever comes, we will face it together." Her courage humbled him in ways he could not express, and in that moment he made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, Raphael called a meeting of all his senior lieutenants, every man who held significant power in his organization, every person whose loyalty he had cultivated over years of careful relationship building. They gathered in the large conference room of his main business office, and when they were all assembled, Raphael stood at the head of the table and told them what he had decided. He was stepping down as the active leader of the organization. He would retain his ownership stake and his ultimate authority, but the day-to-day operations would be handed over to a council of 3 trusted men who would share responsibility for running things. He would remain available for consultation on major decisions, but he would no longer be involved in the details of the business. And anyone who had a problem with this arrangement was free to voice their concerns now, in this room, where they could be addressed directly. The silence that followed his announcement was deafening. Raphael looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each man in turn, and he saw surprise, confusion, and in a few cases, barely concealed calculation. He knew that some of them were already thinking about how they might benefit from this change, how they might position themselves for greater power in the new structure. But he also saw loyalty in some faces, genuine respect in others, and he knew that the core of his organization would hold together even as he stepped back. One man spoke up, an older lieutenant named Carlos who had been with Raphael since the early days. "May I ask why?" Carlos said. "You have built this empire with your own hands. Why would you walk away from it now?" Raphael looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because I have finally found something worth living for," he said simply, "and I cannot protect it if I am constantly surrounded by the things that threaten it. I am not walking away from my responsibilities. I am simply choosing to fulfill them in a different way." The room was quiet again, and then Carlos nodded slowly. "Then we will support you," he said. "Whatever you need, we will provide. You have earned that much and more." The transition was not smooth or easy, and there were challenges in the weeks and months that followed that tested Raphael's resolve in ways he had not anticipated. Victor Delgado made several attempts to exploit the perceived power vacuum, but each time he was met with a unified response from Raphael's organization that made it clear the structure had changed, but the strength had not. There were internal conflicts to manage, old rivalries that flared up when the constant pressure of Raphael's presence was removed. But the council he had appointed proved capable of handling them with minimal intervention from him. And through it all, Clara was by his side, not as his maid anymore, but as his partner, his confidant, his anchor in the storms that continued to rage around them. They moved out of the large house on the hill and into a smaller, more modest home in a quiet neighborhood where nobody knew who Raphael had been or what he had done. They lived simply, far more simply than Raphael had lived in decades, and he discovered that simplicity brought a kind of peace he had never known was possible. 1 year after that rainy night when he had knocked on her door and confessed that he could not do it anymore, Raphael stood in the small garden behind their new home and watched Clara planting flowers along the fence. The sun was warm on his face, and somewhere in the distance he could hear children playing in a neighbor's yard. It was such an ordinary moment, such a simple and unremarkable scene, and yet it filled him with a joy so profound that he almost could not contain it. Clara looked up and caught him watching her, and she smiled that same small, warm smile that had captured his heart so long ago. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He walked over to her and knelt down beside her in the dirt, not caring about his clothes or his dignity or any of the things that would have mattered to the man he used to be. "I am thinking about how grateful I am," he said. "I am thinking about how close I came to losing everything that matters and how lucky I am that I did not." He reached out and touched her face gently. "You saved my life, Clara." Not in some dramatic way, not with grand gestures or heroic actions, but simply by being who you are. Simply by seeing me when no one else did. Simply by loving me when I did not believe I deserved to be loved. Her eyes glistened with tears, but she was smiling through them. "You saved yourself," she said softly. "You made the choice to change, you did the hard work, all I did was believe in you." "That was everything," he said. "That was absolutely everything." 6 months later, in a small ceremony attended only by the few people they truly trusted, Raphael and Clara were married. It was not a grand affair, no displays of wealth or power, no guests who came because they were afraid not to attend. It was simply two people who had found each other against all odds, standing together and promising to continue building the life they had already begun to create. And in the years that followed, they kept that promise. Raphael never fully escaped his past. There were still moments when old associates would reach out, still occasional reminders of the world he had left behind, still nights when he woke from dreams of the things he had done, and found himself grateful for Clara's presence beside him. But he learned to live with those reminders instead of being controlled by them. He learned that redemption was not a single moment, but a daily practice, a continuous choice to be better than he had been before. Clara, for her part, never stopped being the steady, gentle presence that had first drawn him to her. She created a home filled with warmth and peace, and in time, that home was filled with the sounds of children, two daughters who grew up knowing their father as a quiet, devoted man who told them stories and helped with their homework, and was always there when they needed him. They never knew the full truth about who he had been, and Raphael and Clara agreed that this was for the best. Some histories were better left in the past, remembered only by those who had lived them and survived. On the 10th anniversary of that rainy night, Raphael and Clara sat together on the porch of their home and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Their daughters were inside, finishing their dinner, and the sounds of their laughter drifted through the open window. Raphael held Clara's hand in his, and he thought about the journey that had brought them here, the pain and the loneliness and the desperate moment when he had finally admitted that he could not continue living the way he had been living. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked her. "Choosing me, I mean, choosing this life instead of something easier, something simpler, something with a man who did not come with so much baggage." Clara turned to look at him, and her eyes were filled with the same love that had been there on that first night, undimmed by time or challenge or difficulty. "Not for a single moment," she said. "Not once. You asked me a long time ago why I was not afraid of you, and I told you it was because I saw who you really were underneath all the rest of it. That man, the one I saw, the one I fell in love with, he was worth everything. He still is." Raphael felt his throat tighten with emotion, and he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you," he said. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond. You gave me a second chance at life, and I will spend every day I have left being grateful for that." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon. The world was not perfect, and it never would be. There would always be challenges to face, always struggles to overcome, always moments when the past threatened to intrude on the present. But they would face those moments together, the way they had faced everything else. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not the power or the wealth or the empire that Raphael had built and walked away from. Not the danger or the violence or the darkness that had defined so much of his life. What mattered was the simple truth that he had found love when he least expected it, in the most unlikely place, with a woman who had seen through all his defenses and chosen to love him anyway. What mattered was that he had knocked on her door that rainy night, broken and desperate and afraid, and she had opened it. What mattered was that they had saved each other. Some love stories begin with grand gestures and dramatic declarations, but the best ones, the ones that last, begin with small moments of genuine connection, a cup of water offered without judgment, a hand held in the darkness, a quiet voice saying, "We will face this together." Raphael and Clara's story was never about the power he had or the world he came from. It was about two people who saw each other clearly and chose each other completely, and who proved that even the most broken hearts can heal when they are held by someone who truly cares. Their daughters grew up to be kind, strong women who carried their parents' values into the world. Their home remained a place of peace and warmth for decades, and the man who had once believed he was incapable of being loved discovered that he had been wrong about many things, but most importantly, he had been wrong about himself. Love, it turned out, was not something he had to earn or deserve. It was something that found him when he was ready to receive it, and it changed everything.